Randy, as the father of evolutionary psychiatry and one of the founding fathers of evolutionary medicine in general, I tried to figure out how often someone like you, who's a psychiatrist practicing in this field, very practical field, how often do you think about the mind-body problem? From a philosophical perspective, of course.
Even I used to think about it all the time. As an undergraduate and a medical student, I was preoccupied by the mind-body problem in consciousness. And as I think I warned you prior to agreeing to come on the podcast, I decided at some point that I wasn't going to make progress on those problems. So many smart people have been thinking about them, not just for decades, but for hundreds of years, that the fact that there's still huge disagreements and not even a sense of definite progress towards an agreed upon solution made me think that I should focus on easier problems, like why is there depression?
Well, that to me, that doesn't sound like a very easy problem. But you
exactly
managed to approach this very well.
Right. But let's talk about free will and consciousness too, because I mean, you have had many distinguished guests on your show talk about both of them, and I certainly was interested before. Do you feel like there's been progress made on trying to understand free will in particular? Let's start there.
Well, so when I named this podcast Mind Body Solution, obviously paying homage to the mind body problem, I never really thought we'd find the solution. It was more to take micro steps forward to finding the solution. But in terms of free will, I mean, I've had some really good guests. Kevin Mitchell, spoken to Noam Chomsky about it a few times, and it seems like nobody really knows the answer. Some people have no choice but to have free will. Some people believe the opposite. It seems to me like the philosophical debate will continue till I die. Mm-hmm. I think you're right, in the sense that it's a great platform for the discourse of trying to understand these problems more. But in actually applying it, it becomes quite difficult. What are your thoughts on it?
So, the time when I really decided that I was going to take a different angle is just a throwaway line in a book by Michael Ruse. And it was about the origins of morality, which I think we can make progress on. I'd like to talk with you about that. But he said, if we didn't believe in free will, we couldn't hold other people responsible for their actions. So natural selection, certainly, who knows if we have free will or not, but we have to believe in it so that we can hold others responsible for their actions. Otherwise, there could be no more morality, culture, cooperation, and the like. And I think that's really true. I mean, and I think that's one of the difficulties of saying there is no free will, because immediately you run into the issue of can you hold other people responsible for their actions, and do you feel responsible for your actions, or can you get away with anything because it's not really your fault? It's a very different question about why we believe in it compared to does it exist.
I think you're right, because the moral responsibility aspect also forms a big part of that discussion. And when I had Greg Caruso on the channel, he had that infamous book out. It's called Just Desserts with Daniel Dennett, and they're both compatible about free will. They believe it does exist. They both Dennett thinks it does exist, but it's compatible with determinism, whereas Greg Caruso believes in what's known as hard incompatibilism, and he believes that things like moral luck play a big role in shaping who we are. Thomas Nagel once coined this term, moral luck, where there's different luck involved in bringing us to who we are. And he feels that hard incompatibilism is a great reason. So believing that free will is an illusion and does not exist is a great way to avoid retributivism. Very difficult word to say. He thinks that praiseworthiness, blameworthiness, these are not terms we should be using, because essentially none of us truly deserve either. We're based on these luck mechanisms that take us to where we are, and yet we should use the system somehow to avoid giving us praise and blame. What do you think about that? I might not be doing a great job at explaining his words, but...
No, but this is right, and I'm looking forward to talking about the origins of morality with you. I've recently dug into Derek Parfit's work, and his work on the necessity of who are we responsible to, is his question. And we're responsible not only to people around us, but even to the future. And he makes quite a deep argument to justify that. But what he doesn't do is talk about the origins of our capacities. And he does all these marvelous philosophical, imaginative mind experiments. But he eventually refers to intuition, about does it match our intuition or not? And my question is, where do those intuitions come from? And I've been very preoccupied by that because I was really traumatized back when I first learned about evolutionary biology. And especially Dick Alexander was one of the people who was at the University of Michigan, and I got to know Bob Trivers as well. And they both believed that, you know, we deceive other people to better deceive ourselves so we can trick them and advance the interests of our genes. I found that quite traumatic, actually.
How did
I mean, I went into medicine because I thought I'd want to help people, and the idea that maybe I'd been deceiving myself the whole time, and I was just, it was very traumatic. So that sent me on a many years course of trying to understand how natural selection could have shaped the capacity for morality, guilt, love, commitment, and all the rest in a way that was consistent with benefits to genes. I mean, so many people see that problem and they say, oh, that means there must be group selection somehow, or it must be because of cultural group selection. Well, cultural group selection is a real force. It's powerful, but how does it all get started? Certainly not by group selection. Yes, there are benefits to groups if more individuals in the group are cooperative and do things to help the group. But the point that George Williams pointed out in 1966 is still not fully appreciated by many people. And it is that if the individuals within the group vary, and some contribute more to the group at a cost of their own reproductive success, those genes are going to go away. So what's the solution to that? I can talk you through that. I mean, first I thought about commitment theory, which is the mathematical game theory about, you know, if you could convince somebody that you will help them in the future, even when it's not in your interest, then you can have a much deeper, richer relationship that's much more valuable than a relationship just based on exchange. But let me pause there and see how this fits with your interests in the origins of morality.
I think, well, I'm curious to know what conclusion you draw after that. What is your problem with commitment theory at that point? I'll address my.
I think it's real. And I think in many groups, especially religious groups, there's an extremely high entry barrier, and there's an even higher exit barrier. So once you make a commitment to your group, you had better do things that are good for members of that group, even when it's not in your interest. I often tell a joke about somebody walking into a church and saying, yeah, I want to join the church. And the minister says, well, why do you want to join? And the person says, well, I might get sick and I want somebody to take care of me and visit me when I'm sick and give me food and money. And the minister says, no, you just don't get it. You know, the whole point is that you're supposed to do unto others even when it's not in your interest. That's the whole point. It's based on commitment and love and charity, not on expecting to get something. So I was very committed to that. I did a whole book on evolution and commitment theory. And I think it does explain a lot of our capacities, but in everyday life, it's not that easy to find examples. I think you do find examples of guilt. You do find examples of people who take care of their spouses even when they get a fatal illness and the like. You also see a lot of examples of people who don't. And for part of my career, I ran a seminar for cancer patients and their caretakers and caregivers, and I was a psychiatrist working on a cancer ward. And it was horrifying to have people dealing with chemotherapy and dealing with cancer. It was more horrifying to see people recognize that they were going to die and that nothing could really be done about it. But the most horrifying thing about the experience were the ones where some husband said, oh, you know what? I know you have to go through chemo now, and I know you're probably going to die, but I guess I've never really loved you. Jeez. What? The idea that people would leave in those circumstances is just so horrifying. And of course, the poor person can't recover from that lack of, how do you get trust in anyone again after something like that? So, and I found those kind of experiences so horrifying that it made me both want to better understand how the other people who did stick with their partners through everything thick and thin. I wanted to understand how that capacity came about. What do you make of it?
Well, first of all, I think I agree. That's pretty ruthless. Firstly, I mean, I think particularly we're both doctors, and in this field, it's very easy to see the diversity of human experience. And
isn't it amazing? I mean, there's no such thing as one human nature.
yeah,
It's just astounding.
it,
And people talk about culture. Yes, culture influences a lot, but even within a culture, I mean, there's some people who are completely committed to partners, and other people who seem committed for years, and then turn out to be completely self-interested. Whoa, my gosh, it's so hard to grasp this.
It's very difficult, and I often think that one of the functions of this podcast was to show just how difficult intellectually and practically the mind-body problem is, because of how difficult it's been to understand psychiatry. I mean, we've had revolutions and waves where we thought, okay, we've got the answer. Neural correlates, we've got it. It's locked. Dopamine, schizophrenia, we've got it. We've got the certain genes. There's so much happening, and time after time, we're left disappointed. What are your thoughts on this?
You know, I keep thinking that I should offer the world a solution. First of all, a simple explanation, and then a simple cure, because I could get rich and famous, and, you know, everybody would. It's very easy. Lots of people do that, but I don't think it's possible. I mean, I think many of these disorders are products of competing genes and very complex and pleiotropic systems, and we're intrinsically vulnerable, I would say, to many of these disorders. So let's pause here for just a second and decide whether we want to go more that direction, or whether we can go back to morality and see if we can figure out that. I think maybe that'd be best first, since we were already there. Is that okay?
Noam Chomsky once told me that when people talk about all these philosophical debates regarding free will and morality, they often forget to talk about the most sane conclusion that we need to draw, and that is common sense. I mean, nobody walks around assuming they don't have free will. And that's the biggest problem, is that even the philosophers who talk about an illusion of free will don't apply that in their practical life.
That's right. So I've actually been talking a bit in other podcasts and the like about how belief in free will causes problems. And in particular, I mean, there's nobody who starts taking heroin who says, you know, I'm probably going to get addicted, it's worth it. They all are confident that I have free will, I can decide whether to take it or not. And very often, after using drugs for a time, they'll stop just to prove to themselves that they have free will. And in the face of addicting substances, I find it astounding that anyone can decide to stop using such substances and actually stop. It's just, and many people can't, you know, and the amount of willpower, is it willpower? What is it? I think studying people who successfully decide to stop and stop, even though the whole wiring of their brain and their behavior control mechanisms have been hijacked by drugs. And those are the people we need to study. It's just so amazing that it's possible.
I think it's always important for us to do something like that, to actually look at these rare cases in society where people are able to achieve such, because that's a feat. That's something.
It is.
And yet we don't really focus on studying those phenomena. Do you think it's just funding, or just lack of intellectual creativity?
I mean, it's a matter of how do you do it. I mean, we know how to study genetic causes by really big studies and measuring genes and correlating with various states. How do you study this kind of thing? What data do you gather? How do you analyze it? And this is why it's still in the realm of philosophy, not so much in the realm of neuroscience.
And let's talk about how morality evolved. What do you think were the basic components of this evolutionary process?
So I basically lay awake nights for months and years worrying about this, and finally went back to an article by Mary Jane West Eberhard. And she is an insect biologist who talked in the articles in, I think, 1978 and in the early 1980s about what she called social selection. She wasn't explicitly about morality at all. It was about how insect societies organize. But here's what she pointed out. She says, look at a peacock's tail. And I've always thought peacock's tails were just as extreme as our capacity for morality. Our capacity for morality is very, very expensive, elaborate, and complicated. And the peacock's tail is too, and the peacock's tail is shaped by being chosen by the female peahen, and as long as they like peacocks with large tails, that's going to shape these extravagant things. So it's a matter of choice.
Mm.
One person, Miller, I think it was, who was it, wrote about this, and I talked about the fact that we do choose our mates partly based on who is good. And I think that might be a neglected factor. But I think the whole idea advanced by Mary Jane West Everhard is that we choose our social partners just as we choose our sexual partners.
Mm.
And who do we choose? We choose the individuals who have the most to offer and offer it to us, and are honest, trustworthy, kind, empathic, and who will feel guilt if they betray us. And guess what? These are the traits that we associate with morality. I think that the capacity, that social selection and partner choice is the key to the origins of morality. It gets shaped further by cultural group selection and all the rest. But I think this is a powerful and not fully recognized explanation for morality. Peter Hammerstein and Ronald Noe have written a whole book about economics and partner choice and its origins for morality. And Peter Hammerstein in particular has done a whole book on origins of cooperation. So this isn't an entirely new idea, but people haven't really grasped that if in fact individuals in a group are constantly assessing everybody else in the group and saying, I want to pick that one, they always try to pick the person who, first of all, has the most resources, will give it to them reliably. And isn't that interesting? This is what we do in life. We keep trying to figure out who among the people I'm around would have a good relationship that would benefit me, and can I get them to choose me as a partner? So we do all kinds of things to try to be the kind of person that would be a preferred partner. We show off, we accumulate riches, we share our riches in potlatch-like ceremonies, I was in Newport Beach last week, and it was just amusing to see these, many multi-million-dollar yachts cruising so people could have a drink together, and gigantic houses. I mean, this is all display. It's conspicuous consumption, of course, but there's a reason for it, though. It's because people want to advertise what they have to offer in order to get the best possible partners to choose them. And this has a very, very unfortunate side effect. It results in a hierarchy. For those who have the most to offer and offer it, honestly with integrity, pair up with each other. And the people who have less to offer and who are maybe less good at telling what other people want and less honest are down there. And then there are other people down at the bottom off the screen who don't have that much to offer. And we wonder why many people who are disadvantaged aren't necessarily having as much integrity and commitment to other people. Sometimes they do, which is very important. But this creates a hierarchy of partnerships, and those who have the most connect with those who have the most. And the whole damn thing shapes extraordinarily strong capacities for morality. And I don't think we should call them, just in the service of our genes. It is in the service of our genes. It only evolves because it benefits the individual. But it's not any short-term calculated anything. Anybody who takes that view is not a good partner. What do you make of all that?
Well, as you were saying that, something that did come to my mind was Richard Dawkins when he wrote The Selfish Gene. I mean, it paved the way for a certain way of thinking about this topic for a lot of people. And that is, certain acts of kindness, certain things like altruist behaviors always tend to secure some sort of a gene survival. In essence, do you think that, first of all, do you think that it holds to be true in the long run? Or do you think that the social gene is more important? So for accumulation of genes over time, different variations, including partners, society, etc. Do you think over time that we're better adapted to, sorry, let me just rephrase this because I feel like I'm getting a bit lost for words here. If you take into account our own genes, trying to proliferate and continue within society versus that of trying to proliferate the genes of others with your own, do you think it's more important for your own to get through or to get others across instead of yours or in spite of your own?
So what you're edging towards, I think, is the idea of kin selection, which Bill Hamilton showed us all in two big papers, 1964. And that idea, as probably most of your listeners already know, is that we can do things that sacrifice our own benefits and even our own personal reproductive success if it sufficiently benefits relatives who have the same genes that are identical by descent. And this idea has completely revolutionized the study of animal behavior, and it explains all kinds of altruistic behavior that is otherwise inexplicable. But it doesn't explain a lot of complex social behavior in humans, where we have these deep relationships with people who are not related to us. The vast majority of our close relationships are, of course, with people who are related to us. And all these politicians keep trying to pass on their presidencies or their kingships to their kids and all the rest. So it's very, nepotism is very, very deep for very good evolutionary reasons. But nonetheless, we humans do have this capacity to feel commitment and loyalty and to make sacrifices for other individuals and for our groups. And then the constant instant question is, yes, is that because the groups benefit and groups with more such individuals do better than other groups? Those groups do better than other groups, but that's not the reason that natural selection has maintained those genes. It's because the individuals within those groups who do those things and have those tendencies, on the average, have more offspring and benefit their relatives more than others. So Dawkins is completely right that you can think of selfish genes, and you should think of anything that has to benefit the genes, otherwise it's going to get eliminated. But this is so confusing for people.
I think
I want just one thing. On the anniversary of Dawkins' 30th anniversary of the book, I was invited to contribute a chapter, which I did. And I said, I'll do it so long as I can name the chapter whatever I want. And they said, that's okay. So I wrote a chapter called Why So Many People with Selfish Genes Are Generally Pretty Nice, Except for Their Hatred of the Book, The Selfish Gene.
Nice.
And in that chapter, I talk about the origins of morality in partner choice. Which is, at the end of his book, Dawkins says, now that we know that genes are selfish, we can decide to triumph over those. Well, that's pretty lame.
So he often says that his initial title for the book was The Immortal Gene, because a lot of people, that's what he wanted to name it. But obviously with publishers, you have to sort of bite your tongue and sort of go with what's going to sell. But do you think that would have been a better?
No, I think the book, the analogy he makes in the metaphor was brilliant, and it's got legs, obviously, and the controversy it stirred has further advanced its influence. If only people could understand, however, that, I've written several articles for philosophy journals about why selfish genes make generous people.
Yes.
And people misunderstand. They think that because genes are, and I've seen this actually harm people. I've seen people who learn that, all individuals are shaped by natural selection to do things that benefits their genes. And they say to themselves, oh, I've been a sucker. I've been doing things to benefit my friends and my groups. I'm going to just start doing things for myself. I think this is genuine. I was at the origins of the Human Behavior and Evolution Society and evolutionary psychology. And there were a number of people who, that insight that all behavior by all organisms must ultimately increase gene transmission, harm their lives.
Yeah, I can imagine that. It sounds very accurate to me, because the book is so misinterpreted. For the most part, if I hear someone talk about it, they often, you can clearly hear where it goes wrong. Something I did want to ask you about this was, do you feel that when you tell people you're an evolutionary psychiatrist, that, because obviously lots of people won't know that you're this kind-hearted man who's trying to figure out why humans are suffering, trying to do all these things to help humanity, and yet immediately the association of the word evolution rubs people the wrong way sometimes. They just tend, this guy's going to explain things in terms of biomechanisms that's going to ruin this entire human experience. How do you feel this has happened?
It's real. I mean, when George Williams and I first started Darwinian medicine, he insisted on using the word Darwin because he said Darwin deserves credit and evolution is too general. Evolution just means change, and Darwinian refers to change as a result of natural selection. So, I mean, he got his way after we talked about it for a day, but it was only a few years later it was really clear that the word Darwinian was a red flag for so many people. Made them, they say, oh, Darwinian and Nazis, that was their association. And so most of us agreed to change it to evolutionary medicine. It's exactly the same thing. But even that, as you say, is problematic for many people, especially in the United States, where I would never introduce myself to a patient as an evolutionary psychiatrist. It's not that relevant, really. In fact, I tell people that if they meet a doctor who says, I'm an evolutionary doctor, they should be very, very skeptical. Because probably that person is touting some wacko, post cures of some sort or another. Much better to use evolutionary biology and our understanding of it to both understand people and make sure that we try to use whatever treatments have been best shown to really be effective.
Have you ever spoken about, I'm not sure if anyone's ever asked you this, but who are some of your favorite evolutionary biologists? Do you consider Darwin to be one of the greatest scientists of all time?
Of course. But everybody talks about that. There's a great tendency for we humans to deify certain individuals. And it's fascinating, isn't it? That we want super, and it doesn't matter what field you're in, whether it's opera or sports or something, there's always somebody that everybody is supposed to follow. And even now, many people say, well, Darwin said. And just like Freud, the many Freudians quote Freud to make their argument. And why? That you'd think that after 100 years or 200 years, things would have advanced substantially. But nonetheless, Darwin's insight was spectacular, along with Wallace, who had a somewhat different moral Lamarckian view. And the fascinating thing, again, is that nobody actually really thought about it before. His grandfather, came very, very close. In his great poem, Zoonomia, the opening phrases talk about the origins of everything in snails. He even had book plates for his books. Darwin's grandfather, saying everything from snails, and the local vicar said, you really shouldn't have that painted on the side of your coach. You're going to lose patience, and I'll see to it that you lose patience. So I guess he had it painted over on his coach, but he put it on his books. But this is, I sympathize with this. And I think just telling people that, you don't understand Israel evolution and quit all this silly religion things, my gosh, across the whole world, people get great relief and great benefit from their spiritual beliefs and belonging to such groups, much more so than any of us gain from joining scientific groups. And I think, to ridicule that or to lack of respect for it is just as hugely naive.
I think I agree with that sentiment. I think that it's often people can't help but to discuss evolution with religion, and vice versa. Someone who's religious can't help but counter anyone who's talking about anything remotely non-religious with some sort of an evolutionary critique or bring it into it. So it's weird how they're just not mutually exclusive for people. It's something.
And Richard, of course, he's not done much about evolution in recent years. He's mostly advocated atheism and tried to make the argument that religion is an evil force in the world. And he's certainly right that there's a lot of evil that is initiated and proposed by religious conflicts and the like. But there's also a lot of good. And I just think the idea that we can dismiss it, every generation has a couple of people who say this religious stuff is stupid, quit doing it. And they get a lot of attention, and the world goes on just the same.
and there's always new religions forming all the time as well.
And isn't that interesting? Yes, indeed. Yeah.
No, there's the advocates. There's always going to be something new. Have you think about the evolution of that and why it's occurring all the time?
Yes, right.
Do you ever think about that?
So I don't think I heard that.
Sorry, I said, do you ever think about the evolution of religions and why they keep occurring this way?
I almost spent several years of my life writing about the evolution of religious impulses and religions. I finally decided also not to do that one, along with not trying to solve consciousness and free will, because it just seemed that there wasn't going to be a specific solution. But a lot of other people have taken it on, and I think quite successfully talked about, how the cognitive and emotional tendencies. Robert Wright, in particular, I especially like his work on this, and because he took the trouble to actually understand and study religions instead of just globally dismissing them. So I think his work about that is quite profound. There's several other people who have also worked on that.
I think it's quite fascinating when you think about the field of psychiatry and how it's grown over time. I mean, the evolution of psychiatry, let's say. And you had these two great psychiatrists at the time, in terms of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. And you can sort of see how these two figures sort of almost just separate, and you've got these group of thinkers below, and the way they sort of approach these fields. I mean, you've got the Freudian thinkers, psychoanalyzing things, and then you've got the Jungians. What are they called? And there's always with those who support Freud, it seems to be a lot more harsh science, and then those who love Carl Jung, it's a lot softer and always linked to some sort of a spiritual practice. Have you noticed that, and do you agree with it? And what are your thoughts on it?
In general, yes. I mean, we should just pause and note that Freud's great discovery was that there really is an unconscious, and it gets us to do a lot of things without our knowledge. And many psychiatrists today dismiss all of Freudianism and psychodynamics. And that's so pathetic, because if you pay attention, a lot of what we do is in fact motivated by our unconscious. And early on in my career, I was so impressed by all of this that I decided to try to understand why there was an unconscious. So I've given up on the problem of consciousness, but I stuck with the problem of the unconscious. Why on earth would natural selection? Because it's not just things that don't come to consciousness. They're active forces of repression. And it really seemed implausible to me that those capacities for repression and all of the ego defenses, that those could exist unless they had some adaptive value. And again, we go back to Bob Trivers and Dick Alexander and their very cynical view that we deceive ourselves so that we can better deceive others. If we don't know we're lying, it's better to lie other. And so I opposed that. I said, that's not what I see in myself or in my patients. My patients are lying awake nights, wondering if they accidentally failed to smile at someone on the street. This is not the case of somebody, trying to trick other people. So I worked on that and wrote several chapters and articles about it. And I came to a conclusion that actually Trivers and Alexander were often right. Quite often we do stay unaware of our own impulses, especially sexual impulses, in order to pursue them without having to blame ourselves and the like. But I also argued that the ability for repression and ego defenses also preserves relationships. Because if you are acutely aware of everything anybody else does and the fact that it might be, a diss or an insult or a betrayal, it's very hard to have friends. And I think with some of my psychoanalyst friends, sometimes it's a little awkward because, sometimes they have their psychoanalytic antenna turned on, and every tiny thing you say could be interpreted as something else. There might be hostile impulses behind it. And what a pain that all is. It's much better, I think, to just be unaware. I thought that when I first wrote these articles, and several other people wrote similar things at the time, that psychoanalysts would say, wow, we finally have a real biological foundation for our field. That has not come to pass. And I think for a pretty obvious reason, that pointing out that defenses and the unconscious are in fact valuable is challenging for people who spent their whole careers trying to, in themselves and other people, make the unconscious conscious. There certainly are benefits to making the unconscious conscious in many, many circumstances, and the whole psychoanalytic method is brilliant for making that possible. I can imagine practicing psychiatry without knowing the basics of that. But psychoanalysis remains, devoted to Freud and and the core ideas and its elaborations without going back to this idea about why the capacity for denial and projection and reaction formation and the like all exist.
Oh, on Thursday, just for context for the listeners, today's Monday, and on Thursday I'm chatting to Mark Solms. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work.
No, I'm not.
So Professor Mark Solms, he's from Cape Town, here in South Africa as well, and he's one of the pioneers of dreams. He understood the neuropsychology of dreams, but he's a huge Freudian thinker, and he loves his work. And he gets upset about this idea that people, as you said, I mean, they don't really appreciate some of the work Freud actually has done.
Right.
Get caught up in the incorrect aspects of the theory. And I think that's a big problem. I think people often forget that things happen in context, and we remove all context when we talk about it today because we think we're so much brighter than he was at the time. Only bright because of the information provided us.
Right.
When you think about the field of psychiatry, I mean, as we were going through this progression, I mentioned that, okay, we discuss, is there anything about free will, by the way, that you want to still touch on, or morality?
I think we've done free will and morality as best we can in a very short period. Let's move on.
Okay, so a consciousness, look, I'm gonna save that, I think, maybe, or is there anything about consciousness specifically that you want to mention before we move on? Because there's so many
we could talk more about that, but I think we're on a track to get into evolution and why we're vulnerable to mental disorders, and that's what I actually know about. So let's talk about that.
And Randy, with that, you know a lot. I read your books. I've even watched some of your podcasts, and I'm trying my best to also make sure that you give us some new content today, because I've watched your concept so much, and I want the listeners to leave this knowing a lot more about your views on this topic and a lot more as well. First of all, I just want to touch briefly on that conversation I started earlier about these layers of attempts that we've made over time. The neurobiological ones, the invention of brain scans, MRIs, EEGs, all these things. And we thought we were always going to solve this problem. And you said it would be great to have this one pill that would solve all your problems. But tell me about why this is such a big problem. Why is it so difficult for people to understand? How is it that certain biological factors result in psychological illness at some point?
Gosh. I mean, first, let's both agree that these are desperately important and tragic problems worldwide.
Oh.
And everybody agrees, yep, they're not simple. That's a good place to start. But nonetheless, everyone is so desperate for a solution that when someone proposes something that might be a solution, whether it's psychoanalysis or behavior therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy or drug therapy or ECT or something, everybody says, finally, and they become advocates for that kind of therapy. Nowadays, it's psilocybin and psychedelics and ketamine and the like. And I think for all of us, we can hope that these things work, and they do work for some people. And generalizations, ketamine is good, ketamine is bad. I don't know. We should do proper studies and do double-blind controls as best we can, and follow up with people, and not try to prove that it works or prove that it doesn't work. We should try to have an open mind and see. But on the other hand, after you've been around a while, and I've been around a while, you see all these enthusiasms for new things, and they haven't worked out, any of them. There's two kinds of enthusiasms. One is the explanation, and one is the treatment. Yeah. And I think, we in 2002, gosh, the genome had just been sequenced. And I had the privilege of talking with Jim Watson and others at that time. And we were all saying, finally, we're going to find the source for schizophrenia. Yes. And I believe that we would too. I mean, we all believed we would. We thought we'd find the bad common genes, and that would lead us to the pathways, and that would lead us to new drugs. And finally, we would really have a scientific understanding of the cause, and it would lead us to new treatments. And the disappointment has been absolutely devastating. And some people are honest about that, but not as much as they need to be. I mean, it's absolutely tragic that it hasn't worked. And now we need to, pull up our bootstraps and move on. But where do we move on to? And just to summarize some of that data, in case your viewers don't all know it, we now know there are thousands of genes that influence the risk of schizophrenia, the vast majority of which increase your risk by 1% or less. And furthermore, the first thing we're all taught in psychiatry about diagnosis is that schizophrenia and bipolar disease are fundamentally different illnesses. So wise books and chapters and studies have meant to figure out which one does this patient have. And now we know that the genes overlap massively. It's to a considerable extent the same genes. So the disappointment, people, in fact, the DSM, probably some of your listeners share my frustration with simplistic diagnostic categories. Gosh, when they wrote the DSM-3, the idea was that it would be a temporary document until we finally found the genes and brain mechanisms, and we could define our diagnoses based on specific pathophysiology like the rest of medicine. It was a grand dream. And not only has it not been reached, it's very clear now it will not be reached. Is that too strong? I still hope it will be reached. I really do. I hope we can find some brain pathway, some kind of neuron type that is way more common in people with schizophrenia or bipolar disease, because we so badly need to find better treatments for these things. But you better not bet on it. I think we need to take different approaches. My approach to this is to, in fact, ask why we're also vulnerable to these things. Do you know that even the people with the fewest genes that predispose to schizophrenia can still get it? If you do polygenic scores, you can take people who have the lowest polygenic scores, you go through their whole genome, and they have very, very few genes that could increase the risk of schizophrenia, but some people in those groups still get it. Yes, it could be because they have very, very rare genes of large effect. It's possible. But what I think we should be asking is why the whole system is vulnerable. And not just for schizophrenia. Epilepsy is another really good one. I mean, highly heritable disease. In that case, there are a few genes that are common and have more impact than for schizophrenia. But why is it that that disease remains so? We all have a capacity for epilepsy, and it's not an adaptation. It's just how the system goes wrong in response to what? Trauma, toxins, fever, infection, any number of things can set off epilepsy. It seems like the whole system has been pushed to some peak of performance that's right next to a cliff edge, where it's vulnerable to substantial failure. And many machines are programmed. Engineers design many machines to be pushed to the edge, and especially machines that are race cars, things that are competing. They're all vulnerable, because to get a race car that's as fast as possible, it has to be very, very light, and that makes it fragile. And this argument can be used for schizophrenia. I'll wrap this up in a second, just with a paper that I've really liked recently by Lou, looking at the history of alleles that influence the risk of schizophrenia. And their short answer is that those that are derived, that are new, are more likely to protect against schizophrenia. Those that are ancestral alleles, that are old, are more likely to increase the risk of schizophrenia, suggesting that the very fast selection for our amazing capacities for language and intelligence and social skills may have disrupted all kinds of connections and systems in the brain in a way that makes them vulnerable. And natural selection is still now trying to make the brain more robust from the kinds of failures that result.
Do you think a massive factor around this, because you were talking about how even if you have the genes if you have a very few genes that would predispose you to certain illnesses, let's say, that we're still finding it? Because I think one of those reasons would be the fact that we're just so diverse, in the sense that we have billions of us at this point. If you study enough of us, at this point, the odds of someone having something increases so much more because of how many there are of us. I think with smaller population chunks, at that point, these rates of illnesses would just drop tremendously because of that.
I'm not sure what you're meaning there. Indeed,
Sorry, Randy, I think you broke off a little there. Am I still functioning on your side? Randy, I've lost you. Let's make sure if my connection's fine on this side. Randy, I'm just going to send you a mail. It's because I can't. Right, Randy, thanks. You managed to successfully reboot there.
Yep, and it didn't take as long as sometimes. That's good. I don't know what happens. They say they're upgrading me to a faster connection. Maybe that was it. Who knows?
Well, I'm actually surprised. An hour went by very fast.
Yes, there's more to say. Let's see what else we want to cover. Where were we?
So, okay, wait. Randy, I just want to quickly ask you. You touched on the DSM, and the DSM. Do you ever find it limiting and concerning in the fact that it's such a basic description of the human experience? Well, that's my opinion, at least.
So you'd love a little anecdote about all of this. And Dan Stein is one of my close colleagues, a psychiatrist there in Cape Town. I have huge admiration for him, and we decided that we'd use an evolutionary approach to propose a better diagnostic system, because it's really clear that there are evolutionary explanations for why humans are vulnerable to some of these disorders. So we worked on this for about a year, thinking we'd come up with something better. And at the end of that time, we concluded, you know what? The DSM is really a pretty good description of what we clinicians see. And everybody's mad at it and complains about it because they are unable to find specific neuroscience causes for those diseases. And the National Institute of Mental Health just abandoned it. And they decided, we're not going to require it anymore because we can't find the specific neuroscience causes for these diseases. Therefore, there must be something wrong with the diagnoses. Wait a second. That's a huge assumption, isn't it? That's an assumption that there are specific neuroscience causes for each of these diseases. There are brain mechanisms, absolutely. And the brains of people with disorders are absolutely different from other people's brains. But can we find something specific, like the plaques and tangles in Alzheimer's disease, or like a missing kidney in kidney disease? So far, we haven't been able to. Again, I hope we will still. I really hope we do. But 30 years has not given a single biomarker for any mental disorder, except for things like Alzheimer's disease and Huntington's chorea, which are, people hoped that their other mental disorders would be like those, and they're not like those. And it's just, I think part of the problem is that the brain is an information system. It's not, metabolic systems are complex enough, but information systems are shaped by all kinds of trade-offs and performance peaks that are close to cliff edges. And the nature, I just gave a talk associated with a symposium at the International Society for Evolution Medicine Public Health last week. The body and the mind are not like machines. And we use this metaphor of body as machine and mind as a computer because we need those kind of frameworks to help think about things, but they fundamentally mislead us. They lead us to think that there are modules that are very specific and distinct, of a sort that an engineer would devise. They lead us to think that the brain has little sections that go connected to each other, but the way computer modules are connected to each other. But when you think about how the brain was actually formed, there are little tiny allelic differences that make some kind of change, a neuronal migration or a receptor response or a synapse, and that makes overall an individual have an advantage. But it also screws up three other things. And then there's another allele that interferes with that allele. The kind of complexity is not like the complexity of machines or computers. I call it organic complexity. And it's an awful vision because we love science because science simplifies things. What about if reality is a kind of complexity that's almost impossible to describe because it's so alien?
I think, you're hitting the nail on the head right there, because I think that's precisely the issue we're going to have with consciousness. People claim to have all these solutions all the time. The brain, that's for some people, the brain, even mentioning the brain in the philosophical discussion regarding consciousness is a huge mistake. You get philosophers who believe that consciousness is the fundamental reality. You get people who take it to a non-human related realm. So it becomes difficult, obviously, to disprove those theories. But some present very logical arguments. I think because obviously when we're doctors practicing medicine, learning about the body, we clearly see the relationship between mind and body very differently. But when we think about this field and consciousness as a whole, I think it's just way too complicated. I think trying to understand the brain, just the brain alone, is already too complicated. I think we're barking up a tree that's very difficult to climb.
So the other project I've been involved in for years with Fred Naidu, who is a mathematician who studies the folate metabolism system. That's a system that generates methyl groups that are crucial for use throughout the body. There are about 32 genes involved, and his model has very fancy equations showing how all of those genes are connected to each other with enzymatic pathways, and furthermore, how feedback and positive feedback and negative pathways control the whole system. And we've used this to try to see if, in fact, the individuals at the extremes of good ability to do methylation or not so good ability to do methylation, and those people really do have problems like spina bifida and increased atherosclerosis and things. So it should be possible to find the genes that are characterize those individuals who can't have as much capacity for methylation. But when we run the model, we find out that there is no specific cluster of genes that predicts who will be in that group. And the reason is that each of those genes has either a positive or a negative effect on fitness, depending on what other genes, what other alleles are there. And again, we're back to this kind of complexity that's fundamentally different from the kind of described complexity that we teach in biochemistry textbooks. And we think this might help to explain missing heritability too. So that's speculation until we publish it and get it peer reviewed. But it's been a wonderful project because instead of just talking about organic complexity, we have a real demonstration of how, most medical research trying to find specific genes for specific diseases has not fully taken cognizance of the kinds of organic complexity that mean that there's not one particular cluster of genes that causes the disease. There are all kinds of interacting genes that are different in different individuals that lead to certain vulnerable systems failing.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely true. I mean, the dynamics of a brain or the dynamics of a mind in general are so, there's so many ways to think about it. There's the evolutionary perspective, there's the genetic perspective, there's the neurochemistry, biochemistry. There's so much in there that it's going to accumulation and a culmination of so many different collaborative encounters. I mean, this is something that everybody's going to have to give an input. Social scientists, neuroscientists, everybody has to have a say at some point.
So you can bring me up to date, Tevin, because one conclusion I come to about this, not being deep into the field in recent years, is that the capacity for consciousness does give a very big selective advantage because we can play things out in our mind without having to actually do them. We can imagine what would happen if we told that person about what we'd done. We can imagine what would happen if we walk through that forest when there's a big wind and limbs are falling. Instead of having to die and having to lose our friends, we can anticipate and play out mentally things and get a big advantage. I'll bet a bunch of people have said that. You can help me understand who's saying that kind of thing.
Well, I think there's different approaches. At this point, I've spoken to so many people who have varying views. You've got a certain people who work in the evolution of minds and try to understand intelligence and cognition very separately. So they try and start at other forms of what we call quote unquote consciousness, but they use various other platforms to do it. So intelligence, for example, or and then just focus on micro forms of these sort of proto-conscious states and work your way upward. If you think of a cell, for example, people like Michael Levin, several others are working on various intelligent aspects of cells and how if you slowly add those layers up, you get to this more complex system of what we call consciousness at this point. But then you've got others. You've got people who work, Bernard Bars, you've got Stanislas Dehaene who work on theories like global workspace theory, different theories of consciousness where you take it as information trying to reach certain workspaces within the mind where to be honest, I don't know the ins and outs of the actual theory, but in a nutshell, we have to sort of have this, what is known as a metacognitive ability. We have to be able to think on what we're actually thinking about. So
thinking about thinking, right?
Exactly. So at some point, we can't just have a thought and not think about its repercussions. It's important. But I want to ask you, the fitness payoffs of having thoughts about thoughts. So this metacognition that we have, it takes a lot. Your brain is 2% of the body weight, but burns 20% of your overall calories. I mean, is this worth it? Is it worth thinking this much?
There are also costs to thinking a lot. I've treated many patients with obsessive compulsive disorder, and they get trapped in a loop where they worry they might have done something to hurt somebody, so they drive around the block to see if they did, and then they drive around the block, there isn't any body in the street, so they drive again because they might have missed it. Fascinating disorder. And there must be something deep about the structure of not only of human cognition, but of human morality that makes these people vulnerable to that particular kind of failure in the brain. But I do think what we've been talking about more broadly, the capacity to think about thinking and the capacity to anticipate and run scenarios in our mind instead of in reality has to give big advantages, especially in social circumstances, because the kinds of complexity we encounter in social situations are just vast. And we do have these things we call intuition.
Yes.
And I should say that, I often referred some of my patients to psychotherapists who I thought were superior to me because they had a more intuitive, automatic, empathic sense for what was going on. I wasn't bad, but other people were better at that kind of thing. And that's still a different kind of, we call it social intelligence, but I think that doesn't really do justice to this intuitive kind of understanding that many people, that we all have and some people have in spades.
Mm. I think, especially when you're working in a field like psychiatry, that biopsychosocial approach is important. It's important for a psychiatrist to reach that point where they believe that psychologist or might do a better job at this, or someone who knows psychotherapy is able to do a better job at this, because that interdisciplinary approach is always fundamental to the management of a patient.
Mm-hmm. So I did lots of psychotherapy and dynamic therapy and behavior therapy and cognitive therapy and medication therapy and the like. One of the reasons I started pursuing evolutionary approaches, and it was even before I met George Williams, I published my first paper in 1984, was because I wanted some way of being able to offer everything we know to a patient and not just the same old kind of treatment for everybody. Now, I do sympathize, in order to get really good at either doing psychodynamic therapy or cognitive therapy or drug therapy, you really probably should specialize because trying to do it all leaves you often making mistakes. But on the other hand, at least trying to think about all possible options for each individual. And again, one of my biggest conclusions is we really must understand individuals as individuals because trying to understand where their emotions come from can't be done just by looking at what cues they've experienced. Emotions arise only in the context of that individual and what goals that individual is pursuing and what strategies they're using and what hopes they have and what fears they have. It's very individualized. And you can't do that, with a questionnaire. You've got to sit down and talk with people. But I think this kind of data, I call this the difference between idiographic understanding, that means an individualized narrative understanding in this particular instance, and a nomothetic understanding, which is a lawful generalization. And almost all of our research in psychiatry has been an attempt to create groups, patients with depression, patients with OCD, patients with ADHD, and try to say things that are true about everybody in the group. Mm. For some disorders, that's okay. Things like ADHD, but when you talk about emotional problems, what emotions a person is experiencing is a combination of what situation they're in, how they're viewing that situation, and their brain. And all three of those things can be influenced to change how they're doing.
Yeah, no, precisely. And I think what often goes under the radar or is swept under the rug is the fact that these diverse experiences that we've evolved over time are fundamental to life. Having anxiety, for example, is so important for you. We often don't think about it this way, and you often speak about it this way. But tell me about this journey and how, we're left disappointed with what the neuroscan revolution has done for us, or the genetic one has done for us. And then you finally decide, it needs more. Psychiatry needs something else. And you go into this evolutionary medicine path, and it takes you somewhere profound, because at some point you're able to think about this very differently and apply it. Talk to me about that.
So, everything in biology has two kinds of explanation. One is about how it works, and the other is how it got there and what good it is, if it's useful at all. And this was the foundation for my project with George Williams. And I started with evolutionary psychiatry, Tevin, and I quickly realized that we had to understand the origins of disease itself in general first, before we could make progress in understanding the evolutionary origins for vulnerability to mental disorders. And so that was a good 20-year sidetrack, which has been very satisfying. And I think it's led to so many people doing wonderful work using some categories that we came up with as a foundation. Why? I was taught in medical school that, yep, mutations happen, and therefore you have to get used to the idea that disease happens. But that is a very important one. Natural selection can't eliminate all mutations, but there are a bunch of other things. Another one is that natural selection can't start fresh. So lots of systems, like for instance, our backs and our hernias and our varicose veins, there are all kinds of complications from standing upright because natural selection can't start fresh. Then there's development. Development is variable. And, even if the genes are identical, the developmental process is a little bit stochastic. And so that's going to leave variations. And then there's the matter of living in different environments. We're in very different environments than those we evolved in. And that certainly is responsible for the majority of chronic disease now. Whether it's responsible for that much mental disease, I'm very uncertain. We don't have good data on that. Some people say that all depression and anxiety is a product of living in a modern culture. Yeah, but Cicero said that too, back in ancient Rome. So, I think we should be skeptical about that kind of thing. And then the things I've just been mentioning, in fact, just in the last few months, I've come to something new. You wanted something new, this is it. The things I've just mentioned are things that natural selection can't do. There are limitations of natural selection. But there are other things that natural selection does do very, very well. And it nonetheless leaves us vulnerable to disease. In particular, it maximizes gene transmission at the expense of health, welfare, longevity, happiness, and all the rest. And there are huge examples of that. Is sex a problem? Yeah, it sure is for almost everybody. And different cultures try to deal with it different ways, and no solution is perfectly satisfactory. Different individuals try to deal with it different ways. It's really a problem. And then there's obligations to kin versus obligations to ourselves. Very complicated, constant conflicts arise, and there's no easy solution to those kinds of things. And then the final category is trade-offs. And my current project is really trying to connect these evolutionary explanations for disease vulnerability to the similar explanations for why machines fail. And it turns out that machines fail for very similar and different ways. An engineer can start fresh. So they're not constrained that way, except they can't always start fresh. And my favorite example there is a tragic one. That's the Boeing 737 MAX. The engineers there were rushed because of an arms race competing with Airbus, which had a new, larger, more fuel-efficient plane. So they couldn't start from fresh, the Boeing engineers. They had to build it on their existing Boeing 737 and expand it to be the Boeing 737 MAX. That meant they expanded it. That meant they moved the wing. Once they moved the wing, it was prone to stalling on takeoff. Well, that would be bad if it stalled. So they put in the sensors so that if it was about to stall, the sensor said, it's about to stall. I'm going to take over the autopilot and point the nose down. And that prevented stalls and crashes. But what happened when the sensor failed? When the sensor failed, it pointed the nose down and took the plane straight down into the ground. Now, the pilots were supposed to know that they should take the plane off of autopilot, but they weren't all trained to do that. So talk about a vulnerable system. There was no redundancy in that system. Natural selection would never make a system like that with one part and no backup mechanism. But on the other hand, it's fascinating to see that this tragedy resulted in part from path dependence. That means the Boeing engineers could not start fresh. It led to all kinds of trade-offs. The trade-offs led to what seemed to be a simple solution, and it wasn't a very good, adequate solution. So there's all kinds of, I have great hopes that our knowledge now about evolutionary explanations for why bodies fail can prove useful in engineering, because there are whole areas of engineering called failure analysis of several kinds, and they're not as systematic as they could be. And so that's a very exciting area of current work.
Well, I think with that being said, Randy, Why did mental illness evolve?
Mental illness did not evolve. And you'll see, I just published the largest paper I've ever published in World Psychiatry. It's something of my manifesto, open access for evolutionary foundations for understanding mental disorders. And the first point I make in there is that trying to ask about the evolutionary function of a mental disorder is just a mistake. They're not adaptations, they're not useful. We shouldn't be asking why they're useful. It is useful to ask why capacities for emotions exist. And that's the theme of my book, Good Reasons for Bad Feelings. There are good reasons why these negative feelings exist, because they're useful. At least for our genes, they're useful. And we need to understand those. It's not because being angry is benefiting our genes right now. Usually it's just wrecking our relationships, and our sexy impulses and our anxious impulses. Usually they're excessive because of the smoke detector principle, which we can talk about. But again, the larger principle here is that these special states of operation were shaped to deal with different kinds of situations, which is a very different position than some evolutionary psychology types who say that they want to find a specific function for each emotion. I'm arguing they have many functions. Different emotions are not basic emotions that are separate from each other. They're not in dimensions. They're different overlapping suites of responses that adjust the phenotype to cope with that situation. And not all that well, a lot of times. And the situations overlap and the responses overlap. So this whole idea that we can label and measure certain emotions as specific things, once again, organic complexity is a reality we'd rather not see. We'd rather, if you want to do emotions research, hey, you've got to measure emotions, you've got to count them, but what if the reality is much more messy?
Yes. And I think something a lot of the time when people think about emotions, they forget about the fact that this affective component of human behavior is very much driven by homeostatic needs and act more than anything else. So a lot of these emotional states are actually behavioral states in order to get something done.
That's right.
And we often...
And they're not that well defined. I mean, why do you have a good discussion with your spouse about whether your marriage is going well or not just before dinner when you're hungry? That's not smart. It's because people then, when they're hungry, are kind of irritable and they're not sensible. Much better to do that after you've had dinner and before you take a drink. Because if you take a drink, that too is going to put you in a special state that makes you really vulnerable to screwing up your relationship.
I mean, and that's a big part of why the legal system often gets a lot of critiques, because you notice the huge trend in people getting death penalties or getting a very hefty sentence just before lunch break. It's a very
that research has been criticized recently as possibly not being replicable, but I find it plausible and it'd be fun to see if it gets replicated or not.
It sounds very plausible. I mean, we are very much driven by our needs and wants in the moment. I mean, if someone's hungry, you see the irritation in their face.
And somebody gets mad at somebody at work and comes home and kicks the dog. Poor dog. But these it's not as if these are very sophisticated mechanisms, but they're kind of messy. They go off and they take over us for a while, or we get anxious about one particular thing, and that anxiety spreads to other kind of things. It's not nice and neat and clean.
You mentioned the smoke detector principle. I think it's important for the listeners and viewers to understand that. I mean, when you think about a general smoke detector in a building, and we know that you have to program this to detect anything from a little small candle that might be burning a little bit more smoke than anything to an actual fire. But the odds of it up in a situation that's not deadly for you is much more important, and we need that to happen in order for us to avoid what could be a devastating fire. Let's explore this a bit.
That's it. I mean, it's a control system. Natural selection doesn't just shape emotions, it shapes control systems to express those emotions in the situations when they're likely to be useful. So how does it do that? Well, it monitors all kinds of things that might or might not be causally related. A dark place with loud noises, I mean, that's kind of a dangerous place, even if you know perfectly well that it's not very dangerous. So natural selection is creating into that control mechanism all kinds of different cues, and you're thinking, to go back to consciousness and the like. You think about, well, it could be a murderer at my door, knocking on the door at 2 a.m., or it could be a neighbor whose car is stuck in the snow, or our minds immediately go to creating all these different possibilities. A good project for consciousness to create possible alternatives so that we can prepare for different possible outcomes. But many people tell me that my greatest contribution to anything is the smoke detector principle that essentially takes signal detection theory and points out that all the systems shaped by natural selection that control behavior and everything else are shaped to maximize average benefits over the long run. So, and the example I often use is, you hear a sound behind a rock as you go to get water for your family in Africa with only a wooden spear, and you hear the noise. Should you run? Could be a lion. If it's a lion, you'll probably get killed if you don't run. It could be just a mouse or a monkey or something, in which case you really should get water for your family. But the risk of one is so much greater than the other. I mean, call it 100 calories to, run away, call it 100,000 calories, your life, if the lion gets you, that's 1,000 to 1. That means that you should flee anytime that the noise is loud enough to indicate a greater than 1 in 1,000 chance. And that means that you can have lots of false alarms. This completely changed how I treated my patients with anxiety disorders. I always previously, in my heart, I thought, you know what, you've been to the grocery store 5 times. Nothing bad has happened. Why are you still agoraphobic? Why are you still having anxiety attacks? And then I realized that that's how the system is designed. It's designed to have many false alarms, just like a smoke alarm, because that is optimal. And that's the case for every other system too. Something as simple as vomiting. How many molecules of a toxin do you need in your stomach to set it off? Well, the cost of that response is not that great. The cost of not removing toxins from your stomach could be fatal. And so that system, another related thing that you're especially interested in, I think, is, so why does it have to feel so bad? Why can't we just say, oh, this is a dangerous situation, I think I'll leave. But all of these situations are akin to physical pain, which motivates us to get the heck out of there and not do it again. And this is what makes negative emotions so painful and difficult. We can tell ourselves, oh, it's not really dangerous. That doesn't do a bit of good. I kept thinking when I had the privilege of helping to start the anxiety disorders clinic at University of Michigan. I worked there for 30 years with George Curtis and with Jim Abelson, who have taken it over. And at first I thought I could actually convince people, no, the spiders aren't dangerous. Let's talk about it. Made no difference whatsoever. Absolutely, useless. Patients said, I know it's not dangerous. Why are you saying that? There's a whole different level of the mind that consciousness can't influence very well. You can, however, have influence on those things by using a person's consciousness to convince them to come closer to the spider and let it crawl on them, even though they're having a lot of anxiety. And that experience rewires the mind so that the anxiety fades. And when patients understand that, they cooperate a lot better with the behavior therapy and just telling them something general about conditioning or something.
Yeah. I think a great thing you talk about the way you break down these experiences into sort of a 4x4 chart of having too much.
Yes, right.
Let's run through that a bit, because I think it breaks it down nicely, and then we're able to move forward with the conversation a bit easier.
Yeah. One of the amazing things I'd never thought about, and this is from work with Isaac Marks, who's a great inspiration to me. We wrote an article many years ago called Fear and Fitness. He was the world's greatest anxiety researcher at the time. And we suddenly realized as we worked together that there was a whole missing anxiety disorder, not enough anxiety. And we named that hypophobia, and that nobody comes for treatment saying, I don't have enough anxiety, Dr. Nesse, could you please treat me? On the other hand, it's a potentially fatal disorder. And there are people, where do you find those people? You find them in unemployment lines and jail and the morgue from just not having enough anxiety.
And the vast majority of men, when you take statistics on their death rates.
Yes, and that brings up another insight that came from this that I think is welcome these days. Lots of books and articles have tried to figure out what's wrong with women. Why do they have more anxiety than men? Is it the culture? Is it the USA? No. Every place you look, women have more anxiety than men, even with other species. Why? Well, there must be something about women's brains, their serotonin receptors. There is something different about women's brains that makes them more anxiety than men. But that's the proximate explanation. What's the evolutionary explanation? And the evolutionary explanation is that women actually have about the right amount of anxiety on average. Men have too little for their own good and about the right amount for maximizing the transmission of their genes. And this could all be fixed in just a few dozen generations if only women would really prefer men who were very cautious. And women do not prefer men who are very cautious. They prefer men who will go risk their lives to protect them. And men who are very cautious don't win battles with other men and competing for resources and for women. It's really an unpleasant insight, isn't it? I mean, don't you wish everybody could just be sensible and get along? I wish we could, but that's not the way it is.
Yeah, I mean, we often see this taken to the extreme. I mean, well, not really often, because a lot of people also have this misinterpretation of the fact that when you see psychotic or schizophrenic patients or manic patients, that this is a very common thing. I mean, to the average person, they believe that these are the most common illnesses, and it's not. I mean, we rarely see patients coming in who are acutely psychotic. It's not one of those things you see every day. But sorry, continue there, Randy.
I was just going to say, I mean, anxiety disorders and depression disorders aren't just the most common, and that's more than 2/3 of all psychiatric patients. But it's also, these are leading disorders for all medical disorders. Huge suffering and problems from these emotions that seem to be out of control. And I should emphasize also, I've just said the smoke detector principle and how that explains how a lot of these responses are in fact normal, coming from normal mechanisms, but useless. But we should also emphasize that a lot of people do have brains that aren't working right, that give them excesses of depression or anxiety. And their mother had it, their grandmother had it, you know, their brains are different. So I think, again, generalizations about it's caused by culture, it's caused by experience, it's caused by genes. It's different for different people. And we shouldn't neglect the possibility that many people do really have brain disorders. That doesn't necessarily mean the best way to treat them is drugs. Often other kinds of treatments are very effective. But we should be thinking about all the possible causes.
At this point, I think maybe break that down into the 4x4.
Why don't you go ahead and do that? I think you have that right in mind.
Yeah, because I find it great, this way of thinking about it. Well, you brought up the first one. I mean, people who have too little anxiety, to a point where it becomes detrimental to their existence. And then on the flip side, you're going to have somebody who has too much anxiety to a point where it's detrimental to their existence. Just remind me, the other two were?
But I mean, it was really about positive and negative emotions. I mean, there also can be too much positive emotion.
Yes, okay.
Which is bad and neglected, or too little negative emotion. So those are the two that are always neglected. Until the rise of positive psychology, people weren't really aware of how beneficial positive emotions could be. They just thought that was kind of normal. But I think a lot of good research has demonstrated that positive emotions also can be very useful if they are expressed in the right circumstance. My gripe with some of positive psychology is that it suggests that it's good to be positive in almost every circumstance, and it's not. I do think, however, to defend positive psychology, overall, in general, we humans have the very unfortunate tendency of having way more negative feelings that are useful for us. And for that reason, anything we can do to, in general, boost positive affect is beneficial.
Yeah, I like that point, because lately you can tell that the positive psychology movement has become very much political at this point. It's very difficult to talk about this topic without people getting a bit too political about it, because they don't seem to understand that sometimes it's important to have these realistic negative feelings. And in fact, we know that as a human species, we're often plagued by these negative thoughts. A lot of them.
And a lot of them are for our benefit, keeping us out of dangerous situations. A lot of them, though, are for our genes' benefit, our envy and resentment and wishes for revenge and the like. I mean, a lot of those are trying to get us to do things that might advance our status and our genes and our reproductive success at a real cost to ourselves. On the other hand, if you don't do the kind of competition that those emotions are motivating, you don't do very well in life either. So I mean, so many people so wish that we could all just get along, and I do too. But I think in order to do that, we should try to be realistic about the evolutionary forces that shaped our tendencies to compete for maximizing reproductive success.
When you spoke about those hypophobic patients, you often see this also taken to an extreme when you think of a manic patient, the dangers of having this hypophobia, the fact that you can go all out and then cause harm to that extent.
So patients in a manic state, it's not so much that they lack anxiety, is that their motivation to do grand things very quickly just escalates and escalates. For most of us, I think, after we have a great success, we come down pretty quickly. In our meeting last week at the International Society for Evolutionary Medicine and Public Health, it was a great success. And our symposium was a great success. And a couple of days later, I was feeling kind of down. Like, gosh, was that right? And I mean, do you ever have that experience of a great success followed by feeling down?
Quite often.
Some people call this an opponent process thing, but I think it's exactly what's needed to keep you from spiraling out of control. Because if you have a great success, and you think, "Well, I am hot shit. I'm going to do more. I'm going to do this. I'm going to blah blah. I can stay up all night." Right? Then you get into it, just spirals up, and eventually the person in mania crashes into a depressive episode after some safety mechanism tips off because they're just completely exhausted and the like. So I think most of us have mechanisms to protect us from going into an out of control positive feedback cycle of escalating ambition and energy and all the rest. And if you lack that, you're in trouble. This is what I mean by trying to understand these disorders, not just in terms of brain mechanisms, and not just in terms of psychological mechanisms, in terms of why people are different, but in terms of how the mechanism is usually regulated and why it might be vulnerable to dysregulation. So in this particular instance, I'm proposing that in bipolar disease, we should be looking for a lack of the usual come down after success that afflicts most of us. And I don't see, maybe that research has been done and applied to bipolar disorder. The field of evolutionary psychiatry is so broad, it's really hard to keep up with all of it. But there's so many avenues that are ripe for being pursued.
Yeah, they are. And what are your thoughts on the RDoC criteria as opposed to the DSM?
It was proposed as an alternative, but not really an alternative. And it has the great advantage of thinking about functional significance of different things. But it's not based on function for what? It's based on these abstraction functions, not about how do these different capacities increase gene transmission and how can we look for the same kinds of things in other species. So on the right track, but it hasn't accomplished nearly what it hoped to accomplish. And it isn't a diagnostic system either. It was so satisfying to work with Dan Stein and conclude that we were wrong. That evolution does not offer a great solution to the problem of psychiatric diagnosis, except to recognize that these kind of messy clinical categories we have are pretty useful. They describe what we see, even if they don't map to specific causes.
You mentioned Dan Stein, and there was this time we were exchanging emails, and I was busy doing the master's in philosophy at the time, where I had emailed him because I wanted to do a master's in neuroscience with him so badly. I mean, he's a legend here in Cape Town as well. I mean, in the world. But and then I was disappointed because he told me, unfortunately, I wasn't allowed to because it's a full-time position, and at the time I wasn't. And I often think about how much I regret just not leaving the first one and just going into that one. What is it like working with Dan?
So there's still time. He's written what I consider to be the most brilliant book ever on philosophy and psychiatry. It's so deep, and it just makes me feel like I'm an amateur at everything, because he knows not only all kinds of things about psychiatry and diagnosis and neuroscience, but he knows the depths of different kinds of philosophical approaches and weaves them all together. Is just inspiring and intimidating and the like. But he's such a friendly guy and open to all kinds of things. And we were supposed to teach a course at the American Psychiatric Association this year, and there was an illness in his family, so he couldn't make it. And he definitely should have stayed home for a month. It was minor, but he was needed back there in Cape Town. But he's just what an amazing, wonderful person. There are also, and if your readers aren't aware, or your listeners aren't aware, the movement of evolutionary psychiatry is growing quite nicely now. And it's really largely due to Riata Bed and Paul St. John Smith, who have been the editors of an edited volume from Cambridge Press called Evolutionary Psychiatry, sponsored by the Royal College of Psychiatry. I think that and their interest group that they sponsor and the lectures that they sponsor have really brought in, I think they have 2,000 people now, 2,000 psychiatrists in their special interest group. Nothing like that in the States. We're behind compared to what they've advanced. Henry O'Connell has started a similar group in Ireland, and he's advancing the cause there. But it's early phases. And for all early creative endeavors, there are risks as well as benefits. And it's very challenging for psychiatrists who don't know much about evolution to distinguish the wheat from the chaff. Because sometimes the most intriguing ideas that spread fast are not necessarily the ones that are true. So and this is hard for all of us. As I'm not saying there's any quick, easy solution. I think the whole field is struggling to figure out, so what are our standards of evidence for a good evolutionary explanation, not for the disease, but for why we all are vulnerable to the disease. And we're just beginning this, and I think, it's premature to make any global generalizations. I really hope, though, that people who love evolutionary psychiatry won't just say it's the greatest thing, and that people don't attack it as everything about it is wrong. It's not a theory. It's applying a basic science that's been missing, and it's hard work. And we're just getting started. There's no funding specifically. And it's not like finding genes for a disorder. There's no specific method we can just turn to. I think it's going to continue to take a lot of thought and patience and trying to figure things out.
Yeah, you mentioned Dan Stein, and when I worked at Valkenburg Hospital, it's the hospital that's directly linked to the University of Cape Town where Dan works. And I remember at the time while working there, I once watched a lecture of yours. I think it was a lecture of yours. I actually can't remember because this was years ago, but it was discussing how psychosis or people who move from country to country, correct me if I'm wrong, Randy, if this wasn't you, but the evolution of psychosis and having these paranoid delusions can occur quite often in foreigners who leave their country and move into other countries. And there's a good approach to why this happens, because of course when you enter a new environment, this tendency to be overcritical of your people around you and to overthink it could be a beneficial tool,
and to be suspicious because they're probably not your relatives and they might wish you harm. So but let's back up a second. I've just been traveling in Europe in the last you can just walk into a whole restaurant in a different city and it's very unlikely anybody will murder you or even steal your wallet. And they're likely to be friendly. How is that possible? Chimpanzees can't do that. They try to move to a different group, and that they're going to get beat up, killed, or something. But somehow, human cultures in general have these welcoming, tendencies of hospitality, traditions, and cultural traditions. You still have to watch your back if you're in a group that doesn't know, where you don't have contacts. And the first thing you do with a strange group is try to figure out, who do you know that I know, to try to figure out if you can trust the person and somebody that if you tell on them, it's going to reflect badly on them. But humans, the first thing is that we humans have this amazing capacity for hospitality and trust and assessing others. But it's also true if you move into a new group, especially young men moving into new groups, sometimes the suspicion goes out of control. And I do think that's another angle on trying to understand psychosis is, we all get a little bit suspicious often, sometimes appropriately, sometimes it's a smoke detector principle. It's too much suspicion. But with patients with psychosis, their suspicion escalates. And more suspicion leads to the conviction that people are spying on me and wishing me harm. And that often leads to odd behavior, in which case people start pointing at the person from behind their back and saying, that one is odd. And of course, that leads people to act more suspicious because people are. So this isn't by any means a full explanation of psychosis, but it's one of the factors that I think can escalate psychosis, especially in a strange situation. Army boot camp, for instance, is very likely. But do those things routinely cause psychosis? Do most people moving to a foreign country experience psychosis? No. The rates are increased some, a little bit, but it's not as if it's an adaptation to become psychotic. It's an adaptation to be somewhat more suspicious in a group of strangers, and that I think sets a predisposition in place.
Do you feel that humans at this point are, if I wouldn't say evolving, well, yeah, we can, because they're changing so rapidly. I mean, the technological revolution and the way things are just continuously changing. I mean, every year it seems to be an exponential growth in technology, in the way we think, in the way we're evolving our protocols and policies, and the way the humans are just, at this point, it's becoming so rapid. Do you feel that when we look back at our evolutionary roots, that it's becoming such a diverse experience at this point that it's very difficult for us to pinpoint well, let me rephrase this in a way that makes more sense to what I'm also thinking. Do you think that we're evolving so fast at this point that it becomes difficult to talk about the evolution of humans?
Or we're not evolving very fast in contrast to our environments. Our environments are indeed changing very rapidly, and it's very important, especially for physical health, to pay attention to the vast differences in diet, exercise, and social structures that account for a lot of problems. But is it the case that we can't keep up? I mean, I'm sure you're aware of railway car syndrome. When people could first travel by railway cars, a lot of psychiatrists claimed that most neurasthenia was caused by railway cars and the ability to travel very fast. And when the telephone was invented, that was supposed to be the end of things. Of course, and then our inability to predict our ability to adapt. I remain fascinated. I mean, you may or may not have been there at the beginning of email, but I certainly was, and nobody predicted how it was going to take over our lives. If we thought about it, maybe we could have a way of contacting people without bothering them. I mean, that's it. The charm and the price of email is leaving a message and now it's taken over our lives, but it's been displaced. You can't reach anybody by email anymore. You've got to use text or WhatsApp or something else. And this does create pressures. And how many people have a zero inbox? Most of us go to sleep wondering if we can get through tomorrow's emails, and then 10 more come in as we do 5. I guess that causes anxiety, but share with me the feeling that people are so adaptive.
It's true.
I mean, we can adapt to all these different things.
I mean, our conversation now was saved by WhatsApp and email.
Yeah.
Without it.
And Zoom.
Yeah.
It's astounding what the things we can adapt to. On the other hand, we shouldn't neglect the possibility that great harm is being done. The number of hours people are watching pornography instead of having sex, yipes. There is some data. I mean, all this idea that social media are causing a huge epidemic of depression and anxiety. Maybe. I mean, it is true that everybody puts good stuff about their life on the media, and especially on YouTube and the like. And so we all get the idea other people's lives are better than they are, and we feel bad about ourselves. I mean, that's a standard social comparison theory thing. So maybe we are now at a point. On the other hand, people adapt so well to so many different things. I think we shouldn't assume that we're helpless pawns. We can do pretty well. On the other hand, I'm glad I don't have young kids and trying to decide when to give them a cell phone that they could access everything. I don't know what I do about that.
Because I was just going to ask you about that. What's your hypothesis on that as a whole? I mean, this environment that we've curated, crafted for ourselves, how do you think it is impacting our minds?
I don't know. I mean, I'm sorry. I mean, these are subjects for research.
Yes.
And we need comparison populations. Yeah. And the fact that cell phones are coming in even to populations that were recently hunter-gatherers, and that's their single most valuable possession because it's a way of connecting with other people. That you have to get cell phone minutes, and how can a young girl get cell phone minutes if she doesn't have a job? that's a very sad story. There's only one way she can probably get minutes, and it completely wrecks a whole potential culture. I mean, so many people prognosticate about the future. Oh, by the way, would you tell me if the international stock markets are going to be going down or up for the next few weeks?
It's impossible. We can't. But that's the thing. I mean,
lots of people make a living telling that.
Yeah, exactly.
Lots of people, and it's fabulous that people are so eager for advice, and so they all get their guru to tell them what's going to happen, and then they tend to continue to believe the guru even after it's proven wrong. So
yeah, no. So there's I mean, lately I've seen a lot of things where it's like beware the guru, or like people giving these counter solutions to these problems. And even within those counter solutions, they tend to start giving him advice that goes beyond their own experience.
And I mean, I might lapse yet, Tevin. There's still time. I mean, sometimes I do think that an evolutionary perspective gives you a different perspective on life and our minds and our emotions and what we're trying to do. And I'm tempted to, offer advice and solutions and say, yeah, we shouldn't care so much about worldly things and sex because it's just a trick. But that doesn't actually do much good, I don't think. So I'm going to stick to my role as a scientist who tries to explain why we're vulnerable to these disorders. And I'll leave it to others mainly to figure out how these findings can be used to improve life.
Randy, which mental illness do you find most fascinating?
Gosh. I mean, all the emotional disorders, but I think obsessive compulsive disorder is so amazingly specific. I mean, I'm not sure how many of your viewers are familiar, but it's not people being careful and meticulous. That's called obsessive compulsive personality. Those are people who wish other people would be as careful as they are and they feel superior. But obsessive compulsive disorder, those people are kind of the opposite of someone with paranoia. People who are paranoid think other people are going to do something to them. And I had this privilege. I mean, when I started seeing patients with obsessive compulsive disorder, I diagnosed them as psychotic because they had false beliefs that they could catch HIV from a toilet seat. That's a false belief. It must be psychosis. And only after we started seeing dozens and finally hundreds of patients with obsessive compulsive disorder that I come to recognize this is a remarkably similar syndrome. These people are afraid that they might accidentally put some poison in the brownies they bake for their child's class. They're afraid that they might accidentally run somebody down and not notice it. So they call the police and say, did anybody report anybody getting run down on Broadway last Tuesday? So that's very interesting. Furthermore, they're afraid that some tiny mistake on their part, like not locking the door, would lead to catastrophe. And the number of people I've seen who had to drive home and miss work because they thought they left the hair curler on. And then they drove home and checked it. And then they drove back to work again, but they thought maybe they didn't check it properly and maybe they accidentally plugged it in again. It's almost as if these people have hostile impulses that are not properly controlled. Not exactly like that, but something like that. And when you think about what's needed for humans to thrive in a very complex social system where we're all constantly inhibiting our impulses and often not aware of them, anything that made you globally aware of those kinds of things that normal people are not aware of would lead you to take protective actions, like double checking the door, triple checking to make sure you didn't put any. And I've had patients who run to school to take the brownies back just before the kids in the classroom are about to eat their brownies because she's afraid she put dishwater detergent in it instead of baking soda. I mean, and these people suffer so terribly. As for cleaning, I mean, it's not just washing your hands. We've seen people who wash their hands down to the bone, and people who take showers, not just for 10 minutes, not for 10 minutes, but standing in cold water for 2 hours. I mean, there's something wrong in the control system for these people, and it might yet be something specific in the brain and the caudate nucleus. There are hints that the caudate nucleus is a site of this, and obsessive compulsive disorder is one of those disorders that can be set off specifically by neuroleptics. Certain antipsychotic drugs seem to induce typical obsessive compulsive disorder in certain unfortunate people. So I think this might be a condition that really does have a specific neuroanatomical, neurochemical basis. But it remains fascinating that it all goes together in the same way. So, fascinating disorder, and has not been, I mean, some people write about evolution in obsessive compulsive disorder with respect to cleanliness and the benefits of cleaning rituals, but that's just a small part of obsessive compulsive disorder. It's a much deeper moral, social, self-control kind of syndrome.
It is, yeah. I mean, those people obviously also focusing on those obsessions and compulsions that deal with something clean, where
Right,
it varies tremendously in that regard.
right, right.
Do you ever think that we run the risk as medical professionals with over medicalizing human experiences?
Oh my goodness, we certainly do. I mean, much of the conversations I have with people is about their diseases and their, interpreting. Is this? Do I have major depression?
Mm.
When I started off in my career, everybody asked me, Dr. Nesse, do I have neurosis? And I had a standard explanation saying what neurosis is and what it isn't, and it was never very satisfying to them. More recently, with the DSM, people would say, Dr. Nesse, do I have major depression? And that, then you can go through the symptoms with them. That's a simplistic way. But a much better way, I think, is to try to talk about, you have excess low mood. It's not good for you. And in your particular case, it really is excess. And we need to do whatever we can to get you back to a more realistic view of yourself and the world. And that might include changing your social situation, changing how you view the world, using medications, using cognitive therapy. But many patients are able to understand that the capacity for low mood can be useful, even though it usually is not. And I think one of the great contributions of evolutionary psychiatry is helping patients to get away from stigma and get away from feeling I am a defective human being because I have a mental disorder. Especially for emotional disorders, recognizing that there are good reasons for bad feelings helps a lot of people to realize, oh, wait a second, there are advantages as well as disadvantages to being a person who has more anxiety than usual. And I need to get back to the more average amount of anxiety, doing whatever I can. I think that's an unanticipated and unappreciated substantial benefit of an evolutionary view for patients. And by the way, you don't have to go talking about evolution, because that just puts a lot of people off. Instead, you talk about, there are good reasons for these feelings. They can be useful. They can be functional, but they often are not, but they can be. Let's try to figure out in your case if this is useful for you or useful for your relatives or not useful at all.
Yeah. It's almost a complete shift of a perspective, because there was a time where people didn't have these words that displayed or portrayed their experience, and you get those patients who want that word. They want the word depression because they get that closure. But in this case, you're not saying remove the word. You're saying change the perspective of how we don't actually use the word. It's not to go back to the old way. It's actually to have a completely new way of not necessarily medicalizing it.
And that's why I use the phrase low mood, because depression has been completely hijacked by the pharmaceutical companies. And if you say depression, the person says, I have a defect, it needs drug treatment. So if you recognize that low mood is normal or can be normal and useful or can be excessive, that helps people put it in the context of real life for real people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And overall, in terms of, with that link to big pharma and the way these fields have been so completely taken apart by these companies and monopolized in that sense, do you find that that's the big factor that's causing us to not succeed in this field? I mean, do you feel that psychiatry is suffering so much because of these issues? The politics?
I ran the psychiatry residency training program at Michigan for 7 years. It was a great privilege. And my goal in that was for every psychiatrist to be very sophisticated as a psychotherapist, a dynamic understanding of people, of cognitive behavioral therapy, of neuroscience, of pharmacology. But times have changed. Mm. And I mean, if I were running a public health service, for instance, and trying to allocate resources to optimally provide for the wealth for the benefits of my population, would I have psychiatrists doing psychotherapy? No, they're the only ones who know enough about the drugs to make good decisions. We should mainly be using their special expertise to do that. Unfortunately, everybody tends to think that their perspective and their treatment is the best one.
Mm.
And so you get these continuing arguments about, drugs are great, drugs are useless, or, psychotherapy is great, psychotherapy is useless. And I think we should continue to try to educate all clinicians to be respectful of the benefits you can get from other kinds of treatment and other kinds of perspectives. And what I'm coming to, though, is, I think it's not realistic for psychiatrists in the most case to. I had a privileged position where I could do psychotherapy. My income didn't depend on it. Most psychiatrists, if they want to make a proper living, they need to prescribe drugs a lot, and they can't spend as much time with their patients as I was blissfully offered in my position. So,
yeah, particularly like here in South Africa, the overburdened population, the lack of resources, the fact that we're stuck in this dilemma renders it impossible. In an ideal world, if we could spend a couple of hours with the patient, suss out the individual as a whole, and thereafter tailor the treatment as you want, that would be just perfect, but relatively impossible.
Many clinics are now giving psychiatrists only half an hour or even 15 minutes to see a patient. And gosh, I think that's just completely inadequate. On the other hand, what happens if you have 1,000 patients and one psychiatrist? How do you optimize that resource? These are public health problems, and I don't know a good solution.
Well, let's hope artificial intelligence will assist with this in the future. Hopefully maybe help treatments at some point.
And I should say that people criticize psychiatrists for being just drug prescribing people and the like, but gosh, I keep meeting psychiatrists who went into it because they really want to understand people, and who really care about their patients, and they get frustrated when they're put in positions where they can't provide optimal care, and they're intellectually curious. And I think evolutionary approaches to psychiatry are intrinsically interesting and appreciated by a lot of psychiatrists, whether they're mainly prescribing, mainly doing psychotherapy, mainly running a clinic with many social workers and psychologists and others. So I think one shouldn't generalize about psychiatrists. One should recognize that there's a lot of really smart, interesting, committed people in there, along with some duds who are just doing what's expected and collecting a paycheck.
Yeah, I think a lot of the time they're anesthetized and they're almost dehumanized by the system itself, and from the outside to lack this empathy that they enter much. It was partly one of the reasons why I eventually left. It's just too much. It's too difficult, and it saps your soul.
So this might be a place to wrap up with, Tevin. I began my career as a psychiatrist who was embedded in an internal medicine clinic. My office was next to the internists and the nurses, and I spent all day seeing patients with, hypertension and diabetes and obesity and cancer and heart attacks and all the rest. And a lot of depression and anxiety and other kinds of problems, lots of alcoholism. They were hoping that I could come in and in a few minutes set patients straight. It was very quickly clear, I was a junior psychiatrist at that point, that no, that wasn't going to happen. I was able to provide good referrals, and I was able to educate the internists about the nature of mental problems much better. But I was explicitly assigned, when I took that position, the idea that the funding that supported it was that I was supposed to help the internists become more empathic and more patient and more emotionally attuned to their patients. And I watched and I listened. And after about a year, I realized that it was essential for people doing that kind of work and seeing very sick people every 15 minutes all week long to have big barriers and distance and not to get too tangled up with too much emotion and empathy and emotional connection. And I think what you mentioned, it did it to me too. I found myself getting toughened up some by seeing so many people suffering so much and not being able to offer anything, very dramatic that was very helpful. And this was exactly at the time when I was writing those papers about evolution and psychodynamics. And my own conclusion that sometimes denial and other kinds of things that keep certain things out of consciousness is useful. And on the other hand, I think as I continued my work in psychiatry and got to spend more time with specific patients I got to know over years or even decades, I think some of my sensitivity came back. And now that I'm not seeing patients regularly and out of that kind of stress of feeling responsible for people in that same way, it's much more like living a regular life instead of being enmeshed and trying to help so many people.
Yeah, well, Randy, I think your work is incredible, and the body of knowledge you've given us is phenomenal. And thank you so much for that. Any final words for how we should approach mental illness and mental health as we close off?
Not really. I think I've had my say, and I appreciate your work on these grand questions of consciousness and morality and free will and the like. They deserve continuing discussion, even though I've taken leave from trying to solve those problems.
Well, thank you so much, Randy. I appreciate that.
Thank you so much.